The rain tapped against the wide glass windows of Alexander Cole's penthouse, a rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead made the silence heavier. Sophia stood in the doorway, her breath uneven, her fingers wrapped around a small white envelope. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but no practice could steady the storm inside her chest. The polished marble floors reflected the life Alexander had built, shiny, untouchable, unbreakable. He was bent over his desk, tie loosened, yet still carrying the air of a man who owned the world. His empire was on the verge of expansion, and everyone said he was unstoppable. But as she stepped forward, her voice cracked the stillness. "Alex," she whispered, her tone trembling but determined. He looked up, impatience flickering across his face, the same expression she had seen in boardrooms when deals were not moving fast enough. She held out the envelope with both hands, her knuckles pale from the pressure. "I need you to see this." He opened it, pulling out the small photograph, the first image of new life, fragile yet powerful. For a moment he froze. The great Alexander Cole, who could silence entire rooms with his words, was speechless. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, and in that pause, Sophia prayed he would smile, that he would see what she saw. Hope, a future, a miracle. But his silence was colder than winter air. The seconds stretched, heavy and suffocating, until his chair scraped back against the floor. "Sophia," he said at last, his voice like steel, "this isn't the time. Do you know what's at stake? My company is about to merge with a global powerhouse. I cannot afford distractions." Her heart cracked at the word. Distraction. Was that what he saw in her trembling hands and the tiny heartbeat on the paper? She wanted to scream, but her voice only came out as a whisper. "This is not a distraction, Alex. This is life." His gaze cut through her, sharp and unyielding. "And it's a life I cannot have." "Not now." The sound of his words struck harder than thunder, but Sophia straightened her back. If he could not see the gift before him, then she would carry it alone. Without another word, she turned, her heels echoing through the hollow space of wealth and power, each step carrying her farther away from the man who valued his empire more than love. At the door, she paused, her hand resting on her stomach as tears threatened to fall. "One day," she whispered, though he would never hear it, "you will understand what you lost." And with that, she vanished into the storm, leaving Alexander frozen in his palace of glass, unaware that his greatest lesson was yet to come. The city streets felt unfamiliar as Sophia stepped out of the taxi, clutching her single suitcase like it carried the weight of her entire future. Neon lights reflected off puddles on the cracked pavement, a sharp contrast to the polished marble hall she had walked away from only hours earlier. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she could never go back. Her heart ached with betrayal, yet deep inside, a new strength flickered like a hidden flame. She had no family nearby, no promises of support, and very little savings. But she had something Alexander could never take from her, the small life growing inside her, giving her a reason to fight. That night, in a tiny rented room with peeling wallpaper and the distant hum of traffic, Sophia sat on the edge of a narrow bed, whispering softly to the child she had chosen to protect. "We may not have much," she murmured, brushing her fingers across her stomach, "but I promise you love. More love than all the wealth in the world." Her words steadied her, even as fear tightened its grip. The following weeks tested her in ways she had never known. Morning sickness made her late to interviews, and landlords eyed her with skepticism. The glamorous wardrobe she once wore to charity galas had no place in the bustling diner where she finally found work as a waitress. Each day she balanced exhaustion with determination, her swollen feet aching after long shifts, but her spirit refused to break. Customers barely noticed the faint weariness in her eyes. She had mastered the art of smiling through her pain. Yet, in the quiet hours after work, when she returned to her modest apartment, loneliness would creep in. The walls seemed to listen to her unspoken fears. How would she afford doctor visits? How would she raise a child in a world so uncertain? But then she would remember Alexander's words, the cold dismissal, and it would ignite something fierce inside her. She would prove him wrong. She would raise her child with dignity, with hope, and with courage stronger than any empire. And in those moments, she no longer saw herself as abandoned. She saw herself as chosen, the guardian of a life that would one day bring a light so bright, even Alexander Cole could not ignore it. 2 years slipped by like pages in a book, each one filled with struggle and triumph that only Sophia truly understood. The baby she once carried now ran on tiny feet, her laughter brightening even the darkest corners of their small apartment. Little Emma had her mother's warmth but carried something undeniable in her features. The sharp curve of her jaw, the same deep eyes that had once captivated boardrooms. Every time Sophia looked at her daughter, she was reminded not of the pain of the past, but of the strength it had given her. Emma wasn't a reminder of rejection. She was proof that love could survive even the coldest winter. Sophia's days were long but fulfilling. She still worked at the diner, balancing trays and memorizing orders, yet now she had a new reason to smile. Regular customers adored Emma, often slipping her lollipops or little paper hats folded from menus. In the evenings, when Sophia tucked her daughter into bed, she would whisper bedtime stories not just of princesses in castles, but of courage, resilience, and the power of never giving up. But life had a way of testing her resolve. Bills stacked higher than paychecks, and there were nights when Sophia went to bed hungry, so her daughter wouldn't. Still, she never complained. Instead, she found joy in the smallest things. The way Emma's giggle filled the room when bubbles floated through the air. The warmth of tiny arms wrapping around her neck. The whispered, "I love you," mama that erased every sacrifice. Sophia had learned to find beauty in her new world, but a question often lingered like a shadow she tried not to face. What if Alexander ever saw Emma? Would he recognize himself in her eyes? Would he feel the weight of what he had lost? She told herself it didn't matter, that his chapter was closed. Yet in the quiet stillness of the night, when the city was hushed and only her thoughts remained, she couldn't help but wonder if fate would ever place them in the same room again, and as if the universe had been listening all along. Destiny was preparing that very moment, a chance meeting that would shatter the walls Alexander Cole had built around his heart and force him to face the truth he had once buried. The mall was alive with weekend energy, children tugging at their parents' hands, the aroma of popcorn drifting through the air, music spilling from shop entrances. Sophia walked slowly, her hand wrapped around Emma's, guiding her curious little steps. Emma's eyes sparkled at the sight of balloons, her laughter rising above the noise, filling the space with a joy that seemed to make strangers smile as they passed. For Sophia, moments like these were priceless. She no longer saw herself as a woman who had been left behind. She saw herself as a mother blessed with a treasure no one could take away. But fate has a way of weaving people together at the most unexpected times. At that very moment, Alexander Cole was walking through the same mall, his mind absorbed with business calls, his steps confident and sharp. His tailored suit set him apart from the crowd, but beneath the polished exterior was a man still restless, still chasing victories that never seemed to quiet the emptiness inside him. He ended the call abruptly, slipping his phone into his pocket, when a burst of childlike laughter froze him mid-step. His eyes turned instinctively toward the sound. And then he saw her, Sophia. She looked different, simpler clothes, a tiredness in her eyes, but also a light that hadn't been there before. By her side stood a little girl, barely 2, her curls bouncing as she pointed excitedly at a toy in a shop window. Alexander's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't control. It wasn't just the shock of seeing Sophia again, it was the unmistakable familiarity of the child's face. The curve of her chin, the sharpness in her eyes. His eyes. The noise of the mall seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. He gripped the railing beside him, unable to move, unable to believe what he was seeing. Memories he had buried beneath contracts and wealth came flooding back, her voice trembling that day, the envelope, the ultrasound. He had turned away then, choosing ambition over love, but now reality stood in front of him, flesh and blood, undeniable. Sophia felt the weight of a stare and turned. Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment the world stopped. Her spine straightened, her hand tightening protectively around Emma's. The same man who once asked her to erase the very life she now cherished was standing there, frozen, as if fate had delivered him to witness the truth he had tried so hard to escape. And in that instant, Alexander Cole, once unshakable, untouchable, found himself stripped of all power, trembling at the sight of what love had created without him. Alexander's footsteps felt heavier than they ever had as he moved through the crowd, each step pulling him closer to the woman and child who had stopped his world. He had spoken in front of thousands, negotiated with leaders, and controlled rooms with nothing more than his presence. Yet in this moment, he felt powerless. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the edge of the toy store, his voice caught in his throat. Sophia. The name escaped him, barely more than a whisper. She turned fully then, her expression calm but firm, her hand still holding Emma close. In her eyes was no bitterness, no pleading, only the quiet strength of someone who had walked through fire and learned to stand tall. Alexander's chest tightened. He had expected anger, tears, maybe even reproach. What he saw instead shook him more. Dignity, independence, a resilience he had never truly understood, until now. Emma tugged at Sophia's sleeve, pointing at a stuffed bear in the window. Sophia crouched down, brushing her daughter's hair back, her voice tender and filled with love. Alexander stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. That little girl, giggling and clapping her hands, carried pieces of him in her every movement. It was like staring into a mirror he had avoided for years. He took a step forward, his throat dry. "She's mine." His words trembled with a mix of awe and guilt. Sophia's gaze cut through him. "She's mine," she replied softly, but with enough strength to make his heart sink. "Everything she is, everything she has, came without you." Her words landed harder than any deal he had ever lost, harder than any rejection in his empire. For the first time in his life, Alexander Cole realized that wealth and power could not buy back what he had thrown away. He had built skyscrapers, signed contracts worth millions, and won battles in boardrooms. But here, in front of the two souls that mattered most, he felt like the poorest man alive. The crowd moved around them, unaware of the quiet storm unraveling in that corner of the mall. Alexander's lips parted as if to speak again, but no words came. He had silenced so many others with his confidence, yet now he was silenced by the weight of his own choices. Sophia lifted Emma into her arms, kissed her forehead, and without another glance, began walking away. Alexander reached out instinctively, but stopped short, his hand hanging useless in the air. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be powerless. And as he watched Sophia and the child disappear into the crowd, a gnawing thought echoed in his mind. Was this the punishment for the life he had chosen? Or the chance to finally change before it was too late? That night, Alexander sat alone in his high-rise office, the skyline glittering beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered. Yet all he felt was emptiness. The sight of Sophia and Emma replayed in his mind endlessly, burning more deeply than any failure in business ever had. He had faced rivals, lawsuits, and betrayals, but nothing compared to the ache of realizing his own flesh and blood had grown without him. The pen in his hand trembled as he signed another document, but for the first time in years he asked himself, what was it all worth? Towers of glass and steel meant nothing if the heart inside him was hollow. Sophia, meanwhile, rocked Emma to sleep, her small apartment filled with the warmth of love Alexander could never buy. She whispered a bedtime story, kissed her daughter's forehead, and sat quietly by the window, staring out at the same city lights he was drowning in. She did not hate him anymore. Hatred was too heavy a burden. What she felt now was something stronger, peace. She had walked away and built a life that was hard, but it was real, filled with joy no empire could provide. Days later, fate tested them again. At a children's charity gala where Sophia had volunteered, Alexander appeared, not as the powerful CEO, but as a man stripped of pride. He approached slowly, his eyes lowered, his voice softer than she had ever heard. I was wrong, Sophia. I see it now. She's everything I never knew I needed. His words shook with sincerity, yet Sophia remained still, her arms folded protectively. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, his empire, his reputation, his fortune, all of it meant nothing. What mattered was whether the woman he had once cast aside could believe that a man like him could truly change. Sophia looked at him, her expression steady. Emma doesn't need wealth. She needs love, patience, and someone who won't walk away when life gets difficult. Can you be that man, Alex? Or will you always run back to your towers of glass? His eyes brimmed with something no one in the business world had ever seen from him. Tears. He dropped to his knees, not in defeat, but in surrender. I don't want towers. I want her. I want you. If there is any chance, even the smallest, let me prove it. The silence was heavy, but Emma's laughter rang out as she spotted him, running forward with innocent joy, wrapping her tiny arms around his leg. Alexander froze, the warmth of her touch breaking down every wall he had ever built. Sophia's heart clenched at the sight, torn between the scars of the past and the hope of something new. And in that moment, the story did not end. It opened to a new chapter, where forgiveness, though fragile, held the power to change everything. The crowd may have seen only a man, a woman, and a child, but in truth, they were witnessing the rise of something greater, a man discovering that love, not ambition, is the greatest empire one can ever build.